Hello and welcome to the China Unraveled podcast, your unfiltered source for what's going on inside China and what it means for the world. I'm your host, Jason Sheftel, and I also used to believe the China story we've all been told. But after living, studying, and traveling throughout the country, I now know better. China's past, present, and future are not what they've been made out to be. Over the last year, I've turned what I've learned into a book, while on here, I shed some light on the big issues. Today's episode is about world trade. We'll look at what it looked like before the last 75 years. We'll ask why the last 75 years of world trade looks so different from everything that came before. We'll discover the true reason for 50 years of U.S. trade deficits and learn when, why, and how China came to be the world's factory. The sort of world we've lived in and taken for granted these last 75 years is unlike any other in human history. So let's see what got us to where we are and what will shape where we are going. Bretton Woods, New Hampshire is a sleepy, upscale resort town. It doesn't come off as the sort of place where history was made, but that is what happened. At a conference here in 1944, the United States gathered its allies together to lay out a revolutionary plan for the post-World War II world. It described its vision for a new international order, one where for the first time international institutions would play a meaningful role. By the end of 1945, the outline of the world's fabulous four global institutions, the United Nations, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and World Trade Organization, all came into being. Well, not exactly. All of them except for one. The World Trade Organization was not formed in the 1940s like the others. It was formed 50 years later in 1995. 1995. A lot of the conflicts over global trade can be explained by answering one simple question. Why on earth was the World Trade Organization only formed in 1995? And have we really had a 75-year run of global free trade if global trade's central body is only 25 years old? What exactly is going on? Well, some very important history has been lost. Here's a quick recap of the four foundational organizations meant to help rebuild and restructure the world. The United Nations was supposed to be the international political body, a forum for resolving disputes between nations and groups of nations. The International Monetary Fund was supposed to be the international monetary body overseeing currencies and payments. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later known as the World Bank, was supposed to be the international financial and banking body, distributing and monitoring post-war development loans. And the last and most controversial pillar was the International Trade Organization, or ITO, which was supposed to be the international trade body structuring and regulating all trade between nations. International Trade Organization? Few listeners have probably ever heard of the ITO, but it was very important. Here's President Truman describing it. Quote, "The ITO is designed to do two things: to establish a code of international conduct to guide nations in dealing with the fundamental problems of world trade, and to create an agency to help implement the code." End quote. Truman knew what he was talking about, because like all the other post-war institutions, the ITO was the brainchild of the executive branch of the U.S. government. Unfortunately for Truman, the federal government has three branches, and Congress or the Supreme Court can kill even what the U.S. has already sold to the rest of the world. And this is exactly what happened to the ITO. It is unknown today because it suffered the bureaucratic equivalent of sudden infant death syndrome at the hands of the U.S. Senate. Historically, killing international treaties was one of the Senate's favorite pastimes, and it did it for some very, very petty political reasons, but also as a check on overly international U.S. administrations. The Senate has hamstrung scores of international treaties from the League of Nations to the International Law of the Sea, and in the late 1940s, it killed the Havana Charter of the ITO. Both the conservative, business-friendly wing of the Senate and the progressive, organized labor wing took a look at the ITO and did not like what it saw. The ITO was grander than any 1930s New Deal bill, but it was no longer the 1930s. Listeners may think of the Senate as a bunch of crackpot, out-of-touch graybeards prancing around with other grandstanding presidential wannabes. And that's fair. But these people at least have a good instinct for how to protect their own jobs. The ITO would have limited some of Congress's oldest and most beloved authorities, giving individual senators and congressmen far less room to maneuver. In a post-war world where Democrats and Republicans were fighting tooth and nail to convince the public who could better manage a complex national economy and burgeoning Cold War, this was dangerous. Congress had already lost power to the executive branch, and losing even more to an international organization was unacceptable. After big losses in the November 1950 Senate elections, the Truman administration saw the writing on the wall. On December 6, 1950, it declined to resubmit the ITO charter to the Senate, culling it from the history books and forfeiting history's best and probably only real opportunity to create an enduring structure for global trade. The unstable structure we have now was cobbled together from its ashes. With the demise of the ITO, focus shifted to wiggling its most important goal past the U.S. Senate, quote, promoting the reduction of tariffs and other trade barriers and the elimination of discriminatory treatment in international commerce, end quote. No one wanted a rehash of the 1930s, but just focusing on tariffs would not make things any easier for even a watered-down version of the ITO. Before the Trump administration came around and politicized tariffs, most Americans had barely even heard of them. That is mostly a result of living in the Bretton Woods era. Before World War II, the U.S. Congress had a multi-generational, passionate love affair with tariffs. The first major piece of U.S. legislation was the Tariff Act of 1789, and tariffs were a permanent feature of the first 150 years of U.S. history. Their function was to limit competition, grow domestic industries, and generate revenue by increasing the cost of imports. According to trade economist Douglas Irwin, tariffs generated over 80% of federal revenues before the Civil War and 40% until 1913. Before Bretton Woods, this made a lot of sense for countries trying to industrialize. All industrializing countries have to regulate imports and import costs in some way. Tariffs were one of only a small number of limited options. It is not a coincidence that for a long time, the United Kingdom was the biggest promoter of free trade. It was the first country to industrialize and already regulated import costs from within its imperial network. Current controversies about the merits of Trump's tariffs are a different question. They are about the relative value of tariffs in a post-industrial, primarily consumption-driven economy, about the trade-offs to consumption and production in a much later stage of economic development. Back in the day, things were way more simple. For 150 years, the U.S. used tariffs liberally, and its tariff rates continued to average over 40% until the end of World War II. In its infinite wisdom, Congress even decided higher tariffs would be a slam-dunk cure for the Great Depression, spawning global retaliation and a downward spiral. So it should come as little surprise that the ITO charter failed to get a tariff-loving Congress to convert to free trade cold turkey. But what did manage to slip past Congress was a provisional trade agreement known as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT. The GATT is basically the trade policy chapter of the ITO stripped of everything else. But where the ITO tried to open the U.S. to tariff-free trade in one fell swoop, the GATT was more sly and did it slowly, piece by piece. It was a provisional agreement subject to renewal every 3 years, meaning Congress felt it had the freedom to abandon it if it changed its mind later on. The GATT also wasn't comprehensive. It was designed as a work in progress, with future rounds of trade negotiations penciled in to fill in the details, expand the agreement, and deal with the really hard problems later on. So, to mix metaphors, the GATT basically got its foot in the door by kicking the can down the road. Way, way down the road. Its negotiation rounds would span decades and basically continue to this day. But even with just a foot in the door, the GATT notched some very impressive results. Its groundbreaking first round in the late 1940s managed to lower tariffs on a fifth of all global trade. For the first time in history, the wealthiest country in the world, the US, was voluntarily reducing tariffs with struggling, war-struck nations. No one went into the Bretton Woods Conference expecting anything like this. They expected a return to what world trade had always been: exclusionary, imperial, and armed, with powerful navies protecting only their own products and often taking everyone else's. It seemed like the deal of the century, and it was, but hidden under this seemingly foolish or noble action by the US lay strategic calculations, calculations now obscured by what we've come to call free trade. Regardless of how the ITO or the GATT were marketed, they were not primarily mechanisms to establish global free trade, and it doesn't take much to see why. At the end of World War II, most of the world was rubble and debris except for the US. The US economy represented 50% of global GDP, by far the largest share of any country in world history. America had been supplying the rest of the world with products and services throughout the war. So true free trade would have meant even more American products and services dumped into global markets. True free trade would have left the whole world at the mercy of the US economy and obliterated any hope other countries had of developing or redeveloping. The Marshall Plan was needed just to prevent catastrophic outflows of labor and capital to the United States. So free trade was out, and what came to be called free trade, or the rules-based international order, was actually about jury-rigging the world economy to do just the opposite. It was about finding a way to put the US economy to work in service of other countries, to give allied countries access to the US economy while also allowing them to protect their own economies enough to redevelop. Now, this may sound insanely generous or just plain insane to many Americans, but think about the alternative. If the US had further beggared and impoverished all the former great powers of the world, it would have been an open invitation for the Soviet Red Army to steamroll everything from Berlin to the Atlantic Ocean. And outside of nuking Europe to stop it, that is exactly what would have happened. Here's why. In August 1945, the Red Army launched an invasion of Manchuria. It was the final major offensive of World War II, and in just 3 weeks, the Red Army conquered a region in northeastern China the size of all of Western Europe. The operation made the German blitzkrieg at the start of World War II look like a Little League game. Not only did this operation ensure a communist victory in the Chinese Civil War, but a rattled United States also read the tea leaves. It had no chance of stopping a determined Soviet march into Europe. The US was a continent away. Any war in Europe would be over before it got a real chance to join in on the fight. So after realizing it could not win a hot war on land, the US decided to fight its Cold War at sea. Today, we take cheap, secure global trade for granted, but it has never existed at any other point in human history. It is a direct result of the US giving trading privileges and security guarantees to all countries who joined with it against the Soviet Union. What the US did was completely unprecedented. It used its navy to give any country who agreed to its terms the sort of global economic reach previously reserved for the most powerful empires of world history. The scale of the Soviet threat is what made this sort of drastic action seem reasonable. Contemporary US trade imbalances and disparities horrify many Americans because we've forgotten their original purpose. What we call free trade was part of a scheme to encircle, contain, and strangle the Soviet Union. Trade deficits were part of the cost of having fat, happy allies willing to fight the Soviet Union, not to help the US, but to protect their own newfound prosperity. I used to think the US created a free trade order out of the goodness of its political heart. It would have been beautiful and inspiring if U.S. actions after World War II were motivated exclusively by noble, high-minded goals. It's just not the case. Economics and security have always been bound together at the hip. During the war, only nations who had declared war against Japan and Germany were invited to sign the United Nations Charter. After the war, countries who tried to play with both the US and the Soviets quickly learned the US had not undergone some sort of moral revolution. What we call free trade, global trade, the global free trade order, the rules-based international order, or the liberal international order, whatever you want to call it, it was created by the US after World War II with strategic goals in mind. It is history's most elaborate, unlikely, and successful foreign policy. Of course, that doesn't also mean problems didn't begin to bubble up right from the start. The GATT started with 23 member nations, mainly Western European countries and their old colonial states, the core of an anti-Soviet alliance. But over time, more countries joined, negotiations took longer, other countries grew wealthy, and this US policy of strategic largesse quickly became impossible to maintain. The GATT would balloon to 123 member nations. By the 1960s and 70s, Japan and Germany were manufacturing powerhouses. Europe, led by France, steadily consolidated industries and created large, protected conglomerates like Airbus. The timeframes for trade negotiations became ridiculous. In the 40s and 50s, trade talks took a few months, then a few years, then over 5 years, and by the 1980s, it was getting close to 10 years. Every country was trying to protect its favored industries, and the costs of maintaining the system mounted, especially for the United States, which continued to protect and control everyone else's commerce. In the 1970s, the US ran face first into major economic, political, social, and military problems. But the Soviet threat was still there, so it made tough adjustments but kept the system intact. By the 80s and 90s, the world had already functionally abandoned global trade and started forging regional free trade blocs, NAFTA for North America, Mercosur for South America, the EU in Europe, and ASEAN in Southeast Asia. Why would countries form regional trading blocs if the global trading regime was working? Questions like these were still unanswered when in 1991 the Soviet Union collapsed, taking the strategic basis for the whole system with it. Yet, after decades of prosperity, free trade was now thought to be an economic and political good in and of itself, and so trade negotiations continued on. But not even the ideal of free trade could help the actual negotiations. By the mid-1990s, trade negotiations had become so contentious, divisive, and inconclusive that new branding was needed. And so, in 1995, the World Trade Organization was born. Its birth was more an admission of defeat than a sign of revival. Nothing expresses this better than the first WTO-sponsored round of trade negotiations begun in 2001. These talks have now been going on for 19 years, and their chance of success is zero. These will be the first and last WTO talks because the original rationale for US-sponsored global low-tariff trade had disappeared. Free trade could now include everybody, and so, just a month after the WTO began its once and future trade talks, China was admitted as a member. There is a lot of confusion over the consequences of China's admission to the WTO. The first thing to know is that unless the US chose to clamp down, China was poised for growth regardless of whether it joined the WTO or not. China and globalization were already a match made in heaven. Joining the WTO just added fuel to the fire. China had the perfect economic, demographic, geographic, and even institutional makeup for late 20th and early 21st century globalization. It had the labor, and the rest of the world had the capital and the consumers. It had a bottomless supply of hundreds of millions of young, healthy, cheap workers with health and benefit costs so low as to be non-existent. Business costs were extremely low because regulatory laws and environmental, safety, and health standards were extremely weak. And China had every incentive to keep things that way because every increase in regulatory costs or wages in the West just made China even more appealing. All it had to do was at least pretend to respect property rights. So what does this all mean? It means China's cheap workers, low regulatory costs, and heavy subsidies and incentives, paired with US provided, cheap, secure global transport, were an irresistible temptation to foreign firms looking to pad their bottom line. And by the 1990s, innovations in inventory and information systems finally let companies take advantage of all of these factors, giving us globalization and global supply chains. Globalization is the process of taking advantage of tax, labor, and regulatory cost differences everywhere in the world. Companies produce every component wherever the cost of production is cheapest and send each piece to be assembled wherever the cost of assembly is cheapest. And just like that, you've got a global supply chain built on the back of cheap, efficient, and secure global shipping. China's original goal was to make sure it became the cheapest place to assemble products. And once it decided to become that place, it became that place. No country was beating China in a contest for the most effective and organized use of mass unskilled labor. It has been playing a life or death version of this game for over 3,000 years. Modern China also had an in. Its historic trading populations on the coast were already oriented towards maritime commerce and connected to financial and technological intermediaries in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia. Once China started to accrue these assembly jobs, a positive feedback loop was set in motion, where continuing labor arbitrage, incentives, subsidies, zero-interest loans, volume production, government reinvestment, increasing business investment, currency manipulation, and what economists call agglomeration economies turned China into the world's factory. What WTO membership gave China was protection from yearly congressional renewals of its trade status and protection from the US retaliating against China by linking in humanitarian, environmental, political, and any other concern it could think of in with Chinese trade policy. However, it is now 2020, and new positive feedback loops have kicked in to undo the house globalization has built. Even before the coronavirus hit, China had reached the end of its growth model. Now, its only possible route to becoming a high-income country involves taking on every other nation in every high-value industry. After already having seen what they saw as low-value industries disappear, countries are wise to the game. Ultimately, the trade war and trade deal by the two largest economies in the world cannot be reconciled with the world we've known. Global trade rules have been ailing since the fall of the Soviet Union, but the conflict between the US and China has officially destroyed them. If China never fully incorporated WTO policies it agreed to 20 years ago, it won't be implementing any novel bilateral agreements anytime soon. Keeping the only possible strategic competitor to the United States inside an organization designed to fight its last strategic competitor seems, well, unlikely to say the least. There are only two possible outcomes. Either world trade is reconfigured in an ad hoc manner, or daring new negotiations deliver us a true international trade organization. Yeah, I wouldn't hold my breath for that one either.